Hello, my name is Pasquale Mackey, and I'm a priest who was assigned to be the secretary to Pope Paul VI when he became Archbishop of Milan, and then I followed him to the Vatican when he became Pope, and then I became the executor of his estate after he died. I worked very closely with Pope Paul VI for many years, and I was able to observe the inner workings of his writings and his talks, his preparation, and all the different things that he did as part of his papacy. What I'd like to share with you now is Paul VI as Pilgrim, and as prophet, and as peacemaker. And we're going to talk about Paul VI on how he relates to today. Now, Paul VI, in essence, was a pope maker. He elevated to cardinal John Paul I, John Paul II, and Benedict the XVI. And Paul VI was very well known for empowering people, for bringing out their gifts, for being inclusive, for drawing out the best of the people who dealt with, and being very patient and positive in his interactions with them. In the first part of the program, I'm going to talk about my initial days with him in Milan, and how he took over the largest Catholic archdiocese in the world, and many, many problems, including a very strong communist influence there, and how he helped turn it around. In 1957, he had what was called the Great Mission, where he had over 15,000 talks, some 24 cardinals, many priests, thousands upon thousands of talks all over our large diocese. And he really started a classic renewal that has followed in subsequent bishoprics with the cardinals who followed him. One of the things that Paul VI did when he was there was he recognized the gap, the chasm that had developed between working men and the church. And it's something similar to today, where there's been a gap between men and the church. Men aren't participating as much in church. Men aren't participating as much in family life. They're participating less in civic life and so forth. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But back in the late 50s and early 60s, Paul VI directly addressed this by going out to the workers. And in fact, he became known as the Archbishop of the Workers. Now this is very interesting because Paul VI was, by training and profession, a diplomat. He was the Secretary of State for Pope Pius XII, and he had worked as basically the Pope's right-hand man for 15 years, and yet he was able to reach out to these relatively uneducated workers and help bring them back into the church. So we're going to talk a little bit about how Paul VI reached out to them. And I'm also going to share with you a recent Cardinal Archbishop of Milan, Cardinal Martini, who in fact wrote the foreword to the book I wrote on Paul VI. I actually wrote a chronicle of my time with him, going back to when he was Archbishop and then through his papacy. And Cardinal Martini, because he followed him in Milan as Archbishop, and because he worked with Paul VI while Paul VI was in Rome, Cardinal Martini is an interesting vantage point. And there's a great deal of similarity between the two. First, their last names are Martini, and Paul VI was Montini. And I think we might even refer to them as the Milan Masters. Paul VI was a very studious intellectual. He had 6,000 volumes. And in fact, they are now in the city of Brescia in northern Italy, not too far from Milan, where he grew up. A whole library there called the Paul VI Institute. Whenever he became Pope, they had to get a whole freight car to bring all his books, and he used these books diligently when he would prepare his weekly audiences. Every day before his audience, he'd give a list of the books that he wanted to do, and he'd come up and write in his very small, minute, fine handwriting, and he'd prepare these talks. And in fact, Paul VI instituted the building of the hall that is now called the Paul VI Hall. It was called Nervi Hall, and at the time he was greatly criticized because of the expense. But now everyone sees the wisdom of this, because many people can join, thousands of people can join the Pope during his daily audiences. So Cardinal Martini also instituted what's called the School of the Word, in which he taught the young people, particularly. That gap between the young people and the church, he would meet in the Duomo with the people monthly and do Lectio Divina with them. He'd listen to them, he'd let them talk, and then he would give reflections that became published in a series of books, a total of over 50. And he became known worldwide for promoting this Ignatian style of Lectio Divina. And during this, he would often refer to Paul VI. In fact, both Paul VI and Cardinal Martini would write a pastoral letter each year, which were so good that they would become books. And they were truly teachers, which is what a bishop is supposed to be. But during the program, I'll be talking about some of the similarities and some of the ways this is relevant to us. And Paul VI is very important, because Paul VI defended the biblical process in the church. There was a reaction during the last years of the pontificate of his predecessor, John the 23rd, to Pope Pius XII, opening the gates to biblical scholarship in the church. And as any time there's a growth in the church, there's a pushback. And Paul VI defended the progress, and in fact addressed the people who were wanting to put the brakes on it. And many of the great scholars from the Vatican II era are indebted to, and in fact the Jerome Biblical Commentary, the best English one-volume commentary on the scriptures, is dedicated to Paul VI. So we'll be talking first about Paul VI in Milan. Then I'm going to talk to him about his trips as a pilgrim. He was the first pope to travel extensively. He went to India for the Eucharistic Congress, and we'll talk about how he broke down when he went to Bombay in an unscheduled report and basically really scared his security people because they had ferreted out the area, and how he went to the Holy Land, how he gave a great talk at the Basilica of the Annunciation in Nazareth, and his historic whirlwind day trip to the United Nations in 1965 in October. And he gave this very famous address at the United Nations where he said, "No more war, no more war." And Jackie Kennedy was there, many of the great dignitaries. He later met with President Johnson at the Waldorf Astoria, and in fact President Johnson's daughter was a convert to Catholicism. But in a certain sense, the high point of the evening from a pastoral perspective was the Mass at Yankee Stadium, where 90,000 people attended. And I joke that he actually outdrew the Beatles, because they had come to Shea Stadium to do the longest rock concert, the most well-attended rock concert at the time, 55,000 people, in August, and just 2 months later the Pope drew 90,000 at Yankee Stadium, which was a little bigger. So Pope Paul VI had many great journeys, and we're going to talk about that, and he had a very good bond with the third world countries, particularly Latin America. They know them as Paul the Sexto. So we're going to look at his missionary journeys, and then we're going to look at his encyclicals. We're going to look at, and not just Humana Vitae, people narrowly define him by that. We're also going to look at some of the key addresses that he made. One to the Roman Rota, which is one of the finest that's ever been given there, on annulments. And unfortunately, it's not always been followed. We're going to look at his address on marriage to the Teams of Our Lady in 1970. We're going to look at his address, which this program is named Someone Always Listens, an address on November 25th, 1970, in which the Pope talked about how many people, and halfway through his papacy, were not listening to him. They felt like after Humana Vitae, for some of them, he had lost credibility. And he was like Don Quixote, he was a dreamer, and very discouraging. Even some priests were not supporting him, and bishops as well as he liked, and certainly some theologians were not as well. But instead of giving up, or instead of pulling back, he affirmed. He said, "I'm Peter, I have the keys." He held on to the deposit of faith. And one of the things that I found when talking to the various priests, because we all know that after Vatican II, many priests left the religious orders, and many sisters did. But that's a very complicated process and a dynamic. Many of those people probably should never have been ordained, but we're not going to get into that too much. But one of the things that priests to a man will say about Paul VI is that he allowed those people to be incorporated back into the church. He didn't cast them aside. He allowed them to be laicized. He didn't approve of them leaving their vocation, but he didn't make it impossible. And in fact, after Paul VI left, subsequent popes have made it much more difficult to be laicized. But I think if you ask people, and his other English-speaking bishop, John McGee, used to say, Paul VI was known for having a great love of the church. And one of the things that these priests will say, because they remember that their former seminary mates who left the church stayed in the, or excuse me, left the priesthood, they stayed in the church because of Paul VI. But besides him keeping people in the church, he held the church together. There were no major schisms, and in fact, the problem with the Society of St. Pius X and Archbishop Lefebvre, I had a chance to spend a little time with him before he came in to see the Pope in 1976. And I noticed that there was something not quite right with him psychically. He seemed to be tormented in some ways. And unfortunately, Paul VI did everything possible to avoid doing an ex divina gesture because of them ordaining priests, but they just wouldn't cooperate. So we're going to talk about his mission as a pilgrim, how he opened up the church, how he restored relations with the Orthodox, and a famous, in 1976, when he actually bent down and kissed the feet of the Patriarch Miletos, very famous, and the Orthodox have often commented how really saintly they thought Paul VI was. And he helped basically resolve a 900-year-old schism with the Orthodox Church. We'll talk about his relationships with Jews, and we'll talk a little bit about how he intervened at Vatican II and he let it follow its course. We're going to look at his major documents as well as his major addresses, and then the initiatives and the things that we've come to take for granted. For example, the anticipated Mass on Saturday night. How many elderly people have benefited from that who can't get up early on a Sunday morning and now can go on Saturday night? And look at the revitalized sacraments. All these things that we look at. And the Mass of Paul VI in 1969, the Missale Romanum. And we're going to go beneath the surface, and I'm going to address some of the unfair criticisms of Paul VI while talking about some of the people who were very influential. And I'm going to give a great accent to Paul VI's biblical initiatives, because he really set the standard for later popes. And what I'd like to do is show you how subsequent popes have followed in his footsteps, how they have paid tribute to him, not only the things that they've said, but the way they've followed in his initiatives and built on what he did and refer to them. In fact, Pope Benedict's last encyclical on hope, Spe Salvi, draws more from Paul VI's 1967 encyclical, Populum Progressio, than any other modern pope has drawn from another pope's encyclical. So Pope Benedict spent a huge amount of time on Populum Progressio, just like John Paul II did when he wrote his social encyclical. And Francis does build on that extensively. And of course, Paul VI, the final apostolic exhortation on evangelization in the modern world, that became a standard. So we're going to look at all these different documents that Paul VI did. And we're going to look at these the initiatives, some of the groups he formed, and come to a synthesis. But the most important thing is, what does it mean today? What does it mean now? That's the most important thing. Not just something then. And that's why I talk about him as a prophet. He suffered greatly, like Ezekiel, like Jeremiah. In fact, a priest once said to me that he was like Jeremiah. They threw him in a cistern. And Isaiah, he beautifully written like Isaiah, suffering servant. And Ezekiel, a heartbreak, and people didn't understand him. And Jeremiah, going against the culture, warning people. But I think the aspect of his prophetic nature most important is he read the signs of the times. And that was the catchword theme of Vatican II. And it's something that's drawn from Matthew chapter 16, verse 3. And Vatican II said, let's read the signs of the times. And we're going to be looking at that, at Paul VI, as he is now, as his relevance to today. And I think you're going to find that his documents are still very open, are still very applicable today, even several decades later. That's a basic overview. Now I'll move into a little bit of discussion of when he was Archbishop, and then we'll go into the Vatican, the expectations that he carried, some of the major interventions he made at the council, and then a little bit of the fallout of the council. We'll talk about why some of the things weren't implemented the way they could, and what happened in the world. Paul VI wasn't operating in a vacuum. But I think we can look at him not only as the person who held the church together, but as the servant of God, and as the strengthener of the brethren, that beautiful expression from Luke chapter 22. Pope's primary job is to keep the church together and to hand on the deposit of faith. And then at the end we'll be talking about his two inspiring addresses in May at the memorial mass for Aldo Moro, when he lamented about the assassination of Italy's prime minister, who Paul VI had mentored. Paul VI, like Cardinal Martini, who we'll talk about in the next segment, had a very good relationship with the youth. He was the head of FUCI. He mentored a lot of the young Christian Democrats, and he was a great youth minister before he became the Secretary of State. So he had this beautiful address at St. John Lateran Church 3 months before he died, in which he basically said, God, you did not hearken to our prayer. So how inspiring it is that a pope would get up there and lament. And then finally, an address that anybody who's there would never forget it, was his final Mass at St. Peter's on the feast of St. Peter and Paul, fittingly, in 1978, in which he said that he explained why he had picked the name Paul, because the apostle of the Gentiles, a man in love with Christ, and a name hadn't been picked in a while. And he said, and then he quoted Timothy, he said, like Paul, he said, I feel like I have handed on the faith, I have run the race, and I have held the church together. So and many people were just touched that he would quote St. Paul in his letter to Timothy, one of the last letters. He held on to the faith, he fought the good fight, and he finished the race. So, thank you, and I'll be back in just a moment.